So now we're going to talk about a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart as I grow older. And it's for the next few minutes we're going to kind of examine the idea of whether or not we should protect older adults from making bad decisions. So as we age, our competencies start to spread out even more than when we're younger. And some people develop dementia or some other form of cognitive issue that limits their abilities to make decisions. And I think the important thing to know here is that despite the fact that there are increasing vulnerabilities as we grow older, older adults are just that. They're adults, and they have the right to make their own choices even when we may think that these choices are questionable. So the question arises, so why should the old be protected from these risky choices that may actually lead to greater quality of life for them? So the dilemma is, when is it the right time to interfere with an older person's decisions and actions if those actions constitute a danger to themselves? And from a legal standpoint, we're not permitted to curtail a person's freedoms unless they're unable to make those decisions for themselves. And I think it's important to also make the distinction between child abuse and elder abuse. And the fact of the matter is the elder is always an adult, and unless proven otherwise, they deserve the presumption that they are mentally competent. Child abuse is a different story because oftentimes the kids are not equipped to make their own decisions. They haven't gotten to that developmental stage. They are very dependent on older adults for everything: food, shelter, clothing, all the needs that people need. But elders, for the most part, aren't in that situation. So it's really hard to find any reliable statistical information on this, but there seems to be a number of types of elder abuse. So one of them obviously would be, we first come to mind, would be something like physical violence. Another would be constant verbal aggressive behavior by a caregiver towards an older adult, yelling at them, talking down to them, disrespecting them. Probably the most prevalent one would be neglect, where grandpa is locked in a room while his caregiver goes to work, and ostensibly he's locked in this room to protect him, but in fact it's probably kidnapping if you look at the letter of the law, if grandpa is of sound mind. So it's important also to realize that this is not a widespread kind of thing. It's a pretty small percentage of older adults who don't live in institutions. And also, nearly half the people who perpetrate these abuses are either adult children of the person that they're supposedly taking care of, or in another case, about 25% of the abusers are actual spouses of the person they're taking care of. Some of the risk factors that come up to play with elder abuse is the presence of alcoholism or substance abuse. There may be a family history of violence. Over time, caregiving in my estimation, is one of the hardest jobs in the world, and it takes its toll physically and mentally on the caregiver. Oftentimes they develop conditions that are maybe worse than the person they're caregiving for. Social isolation is certainly a factor in this. And then any kind of recent loss of a spouse or a job or maybe your whole retirement fund, who knows, house, living conditions, those can trigger abusive situations as well. So I think it's important to think about what quality of life is and define that. And it's probably more of a challenge for people like me, gerontologists, who to define this for older adults, because there's lots of different things going on as the older adult progresses through life. So we take a look at what's called life satisfaction, and that's basically a person's attitude towards their past and their present life taken as a whole. Morale is another word that comes up often in these kind of examinations, and it's kind of a specific feeling by the person, whether it be an optimistic or a pessimistic one about their future. And there's a couple scales that researchers use, several actually. The Life Satisfaction Index is probably the most common one. And old age alone isn't related to just poor morale or unhappiness, but really the big factor here is their physical health at the time that they're aging. So if they are in poor physical health, their likelihood of having low morale or having less satisfaction with life is much greater. From the standpoint of intimacy, this starts at birth, right? So if you leave a baby untouched and unattended to, there will be developmental issues that will show up in that person's life as they develop that are directly related to the fact that there was no intimacy when that child was young. And that whole need for intimacy stays with us throughout the lifespan, all the way to the last day. And we kind of, as a society, have some fun at the expense of older adults from the standpoint of their sexuality. What I find ironic is that while we're doing that, there's plenty of older adult sex humor out there. At the same time, nearly half the commercials you see on TV for some sort of medication are for drugs like Viagra, which, believe me, these people are not taking for headaches. They're taking them for other reasons, right? And so there's so many individual differences as we grow older in how people express their sexuality. So sexuality is not necessarily intercourse, right? It could be many other forms of intimacy. Just a hug, holding someone close for a long period of time in front of a fire is another way to express this intimacy. And the decline of sexual behavior is mostly determined by a person's marital status, their general physical health, or their own personal feelings about sexuality, rather than how old they are and any kind of normal aging changes that are associated with that age change. The continuity theory basically in anything talks to the idea that whatever you've done when you were younger, you'll probably continue to do as you grow into and through old age. So the same is true for sexual behavior and activity. So whatever earlier sexual behaviors you had they're most likely to continue into that person's old age. So there's a definite difference in statistically between men and women in terms of sexuality. Mostly the ratio of men to women as older adults, since women live longer than men, about 5 years or so in this country, uh, by certain ages, the ratio could be almost 2 women for each man at a particular age, in their 80s, let's say. And so that makes it really difficult for women to find a suitable partner, and easier for men. So that's definitely a huge factor. The other thing that comes to play is that men typically can be fertile into their 80s, whereas women uh, experience menopause and the loss of fertility. Um, and that's also associated with something else that's really awful for older women, and that's since estrogen is decreased, as that decreases, the risk for osteoporosis increases. So while you see some men with that affliction, it's mostly women who have to deal with it in older age, and it just seems like such a cruel fate to put on anyone. Interestingly enough, people over age 65 actually have lower rates than other age groups for serious crimes such as robbery or theft or assault, and it's typically lower for older adults than the rest of the population. You notice a lot of crimes happen at 3 or 4 in the morning. Most older adults are, some of them just waking up at that time, but typically they're home and not out on the streets. So the real big threat to older adults from the standpoint of crime is probably financial exploitation. And there are just literally tens of thousands of people out there thinking up ways to say things on a phone call to an older adult, or perhaps through an email or through some other source on the internet, to try to separate that older adult from their money. And so it's a big challenge, because some older adults learn a little bit about computers, and a little bit of knowledge, like anything, can be a pretty dangerous thing. Um, the problem with this, one of the other problems with this, is that it's kind of difficult to prove a crime has occurred. The perpetrator can say, well, no, Mrs. Jones agreed to buy the Brooklyn Bridge, and we were happy to take her money. And the other thing is that a lot of people like Mrs. Jones never report financial exploitation because they're too ashamed to admit it. So the question then comes up, so how do we go about determining when we're justified to interfere in a person's own good? How do we go about determining what a person's own good actually is? I don't know. I mean, I kind of have an idea about my idea of what's good for me and what's not, and I'm sure all of you have similar feelings. But for me to presume that I know what is good for you, or vice versa, is, I think, absurd. I mean, it's just impossible to do. So it is possible to restrict a person's freedoms, individual freedom, through legal procedures. One of them is a psychiatric hold. It's called a 5150. Certain people, psychologists, psychiatrists, other social workers, some social workers have the power to put an involuntary hold on a person. I think it's for 72 hours if they are deemed to be a danger to themselves or to someone else. And beyond that, there are oftentimes court proceedings, competency hearings to determine whether a person is competent enough to manage their finances and other aspects of their life. One of the ways that this is addressed is the appointment of a guardian or a conservator when someone is deemed unable to manage their funds and make rational decisions. And the guardianship can go two ways. One is a guardianship of a person, so that in that case the guardian has the power to determine where the old person will live, what kind of treatments and services he or she may receive. And the other guardianship is of the estate, where the guardian has complete power to manage property and takes over all the financial affairs of that person. It's interesting to note that oftentimes relatives of that person sort of step up and want to take over that role as a guardian. And that's where most of probably the financial abuse occurs. Imagine that grandma's pretty well off and she wants to go on an extended cruise that'll cost tens of thousands of dollars, and you are in line to inherit some of grandma's money when she moves on. And so if you're the guardian, it's sort of a conflict of interest to say to grandma, well, no, I don't think that's a good idea, and withhold the funds for grandma's cruise of a lifetime, only because of greed, right? That that son or daughter can ultimately realize the inheritance of that $20,000 cruise, and it takes away the quality of life of that older adult. Unfortunately, too, in our system, we find that in cases like this, oftentimes these guardianships are not revoked, but are continued. So this controversy has 4 pretty interesting readings associated with it. So I think I know it's not part of the irregular chapter, but I think it's really a good idea to kind of at least scan these articles, and when you see something that is of particular interest, slow down and go through this. In the Brown article, for example, it looks at the right of people to exercise self-determination, and oftentimes these cases are of determining a person's self-determination are really not based on facts sometimes, but just through contacts. Next reading deals with ethical dilemmas and elder abuse. Plenty of stuff to talk about there. Reading 28 looks at the legal side of this, and Heisler and Quinn came up with this concept called the least restrictive alternative, which is kind of unclear because every one of us has a different situation. And I think that's important to realize, that there's not one size fits all in any of this. And then the final reading deals with elder self-neglect. So it's also a form of elder abuse, self-imposed. Grandma, grandpa continue to drink heavily or smoke or hoard stuff so that their homes are fire traps. And so how do we kind of take a look at that? So plenty of stuff to consider, and thanks for your attention. We'll see you in the next controversy.